So before I begin, I'm actually going to link my resume and the like, just so people know that I'm actually competent when it comes to the things I'm talking about. Although you guys can be the judge of that. I'm pretty sure that this will be, yes, the difficulty level has been in fact set to Cipher. And I'm actually reading from a script right now because I don't want to stutter. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tristan Hallahan, but I go by Cipher in the industry. And my talk is on criticism. So, to begin with, Sun Tzu once famously said, "Can you imagine what I would do if I could do all I can?" What he means by this is simple. We can never achieve our true potential, but it is imperative that we strive towards it nonetheless. Asset creation, no matter what type you might be involved in, is no different. You're continually striving to better yourself in your craft, but it can be difficult to give and take critiques. So, ladies and gentlemen, how do we identify good criticism? I argue that it's more about giving than it is taking, because if you show that you're there to help passively rather than outright telling the other person, which can seem passive-aggressive or harsh no matter how you word it, then the other party tends to understand, and if the language, not the point, but the delivery itself, is agreeable and the examples are helpful. Therefore, it is safe to say that good criticism is not merely a balance of positives and negatives, but should serve as a template for the person to improve on their strengths and their weaknesses. Good criticism hinges not only on language, as previously discussed, but also on examples. So let's say you have the following script. One walked off to his classroom just as the bell rang, signaling all students to go to their next class. Character 2 went off to class where Character 3 and friends were waiting. Now, I understand that this is a rather extreme example, but you could say that there's some redundancy in a repetition of the word class. You could therefore shorten it to, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Character 1 and Character 2 split up, each heading for their separate classrooms. Sure enough, when Character 2 got there, 3 and friends were waiting for him. Now, my example is not perfect, but it communicates how to fix the problem in a way that the person understands. For those of you on the receiving end, it is important to ask questions and talk to your critic. Sometimes it's hard to understand an example, and sometimes it takes multiple passes for each party to communicate their point in a way the other one understands. This applies to the positives too. If someone writes choppy narration with good dialogue, show some exchanges that exemplify both points, then suggest why they should write fewer narrative lines. Now, many of you may be asking, firstly, can you slow down? And secondly, what about the bigger picture? Plot holes, artistic perspective, and bugs are obviously more important than typos, coding inefficiencies, and coloration issues. The former might correct the latter as you go. In concept work and drafting especially, wait until you see a micro problem twice in a row or in a finished product first. After all, a draft is a draft for a reason. This brings me to a few rapid-fire points. Firstly, it's unfortunate, but you can't reach some people. It's also harder to give examples yourself in assets other than writing, so you should always have pictures on hand. This also goes back to some previous talks where people discussed research. In coding, it's about functionality and readability, as anyone should be able to understand what a line does beyond simply me saying, it works. Secondly, some art and writing mistakes are deliberate. However, you should take note of authorial intent after you take note of what a first-time reader will think. If a mistake isn't clearly deliberate and you need an explanation, then it should be changed to something more obvious, shuffled around, or possibly even removed outright. Now, I could go on about this for hours, and I haven't said everything on the subject, but this is all that I wrote for this speech, and I know I'm going to turn into a stuttering, slurred mess if I continue. So, are there any questions?
All right, let's go see the chat. That was fast.
Oh my god, I was too fast.
It's okay. You still have a solid 7 minutes left, so we have time to relax and cover. Okay, so let's just say if there was one thing you want everyone to just walk away from, to take away, what would that one thing be?
The editor is not your enemy. Work with them. Ask them questions. If an editor approaches you with a problem and you think that it's deliberate, or you think that you don't understand why they think it's a problem, then you should really ask questions to better what's going on. Secondly, someone asked a question: can you describe how I handled a rough piece of criticism in a successful way? And more often than not, I will be honest, I am the one giving the criticism than I am the one receiving it. But I would say that more often than not, who is my enemy? More often than not, what tends to happen is I usually ask questions about how to improve things, because simply saying it's bad is not good enough. because not only should you understand that it needs improvement, but you should also understand exactly how it improves, because there are two types of processes in writing. There's macro, which is, your plot, your overall scene, but then there's also the line by line writing, which is micro stuff. And as a direct result of that, it's imperative that you understand whether your problem is the scene itself or if it's just specific lines.
Yeah, that's very important. Like for translating an example, personal examples, I had to check someone's translation, right? And it's like, there's times when like this line is just wrong.
Yeah.
It's factually wrong, right? And then there's times like, yeah, I see what you're doing here, but it's not coming across for me. It feels awkward, right? Maybe you should change it or try this tactic. Like that's the softer way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's like, if I just said, yeah, this is not working, and I don't tell them why, whether it's factual or otherwise, right? They're just upset. But if you do it this other way, like you're suggesting, it's a lot smoother.
Okay, so Arcane City asked, what about when a beta testing critic has an issue versus your vision for the storyline, which should you go with? And I think it's really dependent on what the issue is. I think that your vision should be malleable enough that you can really, if someone has an issue with what your vision is, you should probably, like, it's all about communication. Let's see, what should you look for when finding the right editor? Find someone that not only understands how to be a critic, but also how to write or how to, do artistic stuff. It really depends on what you're editing. But find someone who understands the craft well enough that they can not only critique the work, but also correct it themselves. How can you understand when criticism is genuine and not coming from a hater? The answer to that question is really, it's dependent on the language used. More often than not, I've encountered people who tend to be very passive-aggressive, and I find that it's not necessarily them being a hater, but it's better to be upfront with the criticism that you have in such a way that it is constructive on both, here's your strengths and here's your weaknesses, as opposed to one or the other. Instant Riot, what is the best way to ask for criticism? Honestly, just coming up front and saying, I have this thing, I was wondering if I could get some opinions on it. In particular, I'm concerned about this, this, and this. So knowing what it is. How do you give good criticism? Like I said, it's imperative that you use language that the person will understand. So if you go in there and you say, this is bad, fix it, you should say, this specific excerpt is bad because it is repetitive, or it is bad because it doesn't fit tonally with the rest of the scene. You could fix it by doing the following. And then, depending on what type of editor you are, you may not want to correct it yourself. I mean, I tend to be very hands-on, so I tend to correct things myself and then let people work with that. Let's see, here's a flip. This one. If you're the type of get stuck criticizing yourself so much that you move on, what's the way to move on from that? Honestly, I would argue that having people on hand to read it is much better than reading it yourself, because you will always be caught up in the trap of this could be better. Prolific is better than perfect. Let me see, somebody tagged. See, when you don't have an editor on hand, how can one critique themselves better without letting themselves get in the way? Honestly, I think that even if you don't have a professional reader on hand, you should at least have some friends that are willing to collaborate.
Definitely.
Does anyone have any questions that I jumped over because I noticed an ad mention, so I thought it was imperative? Wolf, if you're like me and you have no friends, you can probably find people on Lemasoft or Twitter or literally any platform. Honestly, I recommend getting an editor, period, is more important than getting an editor you have little acquaintance with. I think that more often than not, an editor should treat things as if it's their first. Like, I tend to edit as I go, so my first impression is the first impression that you receive whenever I give you my script, my rundown of topics, or when I correct things. So I think that it's more important for people to do that. What do you do? Yeah, I'm really sorry if I talk too fast. It's a bad habit.
It's okay.
So I've got literally 1 minute left. So does anyone have any last second questions?
All right.
It's a lightning talk, not a supersonic talk.
All right, I am going to find, where is Pepper in here?
Yes, I can post the script if anyone is interested.
Oh, there it is.